Run a background check. My husband Mark whispered the words so quietly that no one else at the table could possibly hear them. But to me they landed like a thunderclap. I froze in the middle of lifting my wine glass. Around me the dining room buzzed with laughter, clinking silverware, and the warm hum of family conversation. The smell of roasted chicken and buttery mashed potatoes filled the air. Someone down the table told a joke, and my father's deep laugh rumbled like an old pickup truck starting on a cold morning. Everyone was celebrating my brother. My older brother Daniel Carter, the hero who had finally come home. And my CIA husband had just told me to investigate him. For a moment I thought I must have misheard. I slowly turned my head toward Mark. He sat beside me, relaxed as ever, one arm resting on the back of my chair. His expression hadn't changed. He was smiling politely at my mother as she passed the gravy boat down the table. But his eyes briefly met mine. And in them I saw something I had learned to recognize during our 27 years of marriage. Concern. Real concern. I lowered my glass without making the toast. Across the table, my brother Daniel looked exactly like the image every small American town loves to celebrate. Tall, broad-shouldered, and still standing straight despite being nearly 60. His army dress uniform fit him like it had been tailored that morning. Rows of medals glinted under the dining room light. Our mother had insisted he wear it tonight. Just this once, she'd said earlier that afternoon, "Your father deserves to see his son in uniform again." Daniel had hesitated, but eventually he agreed. Now everyone in the room seemed proud enough to burst. My father sat at the head of the table, his hands folded like a man holding something sacred. He had spent 35 years working at the paper mill outside town, waking up before sunrise almost every day of his adult life. His back was bent now, his hair thin and white, but tonight his eyes shone like a young man's. My son Jason leaned forward from the far side of the table. "Uncle Dan, he said Mom told me you were stationed in Afghanistan. What was that like?" Daniel smiled in that easy way of his. "Well, he said it's a long story." Everyone leaned in. People love stories about heroes. And Daniel had always been good at telling them. I watched him carefully as he spoke. Maybe it was Mark's whisper echoing in my head, but suddenly I noticed things I hadn't before. The slight pause before he answered certain questions. The way his fingers tapped lightly against his wine glass. The way his smile sometimes appeared just a second too late. Still, the stories sounded impressive. Convoys through desert roads. Night patrols. Close calls that ended with courage and teamwork. The kind of stories that made neighbors proud to say they knew him. My mother wiped a tear from her eye halfway through one of them. "Oh, Danny," she said softly. "You never told us how dangerous it really was." Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Didn't want to worry you, Mom." Mark remained quiet beside me. That alone was unusual. My husband had spent 25 years working intelligence analysis for the CIA before retiring last spring. He was not a dramatic man, not suspicious by nature. But he was observant. Painfully observant. When he noticed something, it was rarely nothing. Eventually, the conversation turned back to me. "Well, Emily," my father said, lifting his glass, "weren't you about to say something earlier?" Everyone looked at me. I forced a smile. "Oh, just welcoming Danny home," I said. Daniel grinned. "Well, that deserves a toast." I stood slowly. For a moment I studied my brother's face. We had grown up together in this same town in western Pennsylvania, rode bikes down the same cracked sidewalks, shared the same kitchen table for thousands of meals just like this one. He had always been the brave one. The older brother who chased bullies away and fixed broken bicycles. When he enlisted in the army at 19, none of us were surprised. Still, Mark's whisper lingered in my mind. "Run a background check." I cleared my throat. To my brother, I said. Everyone raised their glasses. To Daniel, who served our country, made us proud, and finally made it home safe. Glasses clinked. "Welcome home," my father added. Daniel nodded quietly. "Thanks, Dad." The toast ended and dinner continued. But something had shifted. I noticed Mark watching Daniel occasionally. Not staring. Just observing. That same calm, quiet attention I'd seen him use while studying news briefings at the kitchen table over morning coffee for decades. Later that evening, after everyone had moved to the living room for pie and coffee, I slipped out onto the back porch. The autumn air felt cool and sharp in my lungs. The same porch where Daniel and I used to sit during summer thunderstorms as kids. The screen door creaked behind me. Mark stepped outside. For a moment, we both listened to the sound of crickets in the yard. Then I turned to him. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Mark leaned against the railing. "I might be wrong," he said. "That's not very reassuring." He exhaled slowly. "I've heard thousands of military briefings in my life," he said. "Real ones. And some of Danny's stories don't line up." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Dates, units, little details." "That doesn't mean he's lying." "I didn't say he was." Mark looked back through the kitchen window where Daniel stood laughing with our parents. "I just think he said quietly it wouldn't hurt to check." I folded my arms. "That's my brother." "I know." "You're asking me to investigate him like he's some kind of criminal." "No," Mark said gently. "I'm asking you to make sure the man your family is celebrating is really the man he says he is." The words hung in the cold air between us. Inside the house, my brother's laughter echoed through the walls, and for the first time in my life, I wondered if I truly knew him. I did not sleep much that night. Mark fell asleep the way he always had, quietly, one arm over his chest, breathing slow and steady, as if his conscience and his body had reached some private agreement years ago. I, on the other hand, lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, listening to its soft click at the end of each turn. In a small town, silence has layers. There is the silence of midnight itself, then the hum of the refrigerator from down the hall, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of tree branches tapping a window. And beneath all that, there is the silence inside your own mind, when it is trying to make sense of something it does not want to believe. My brother Daniel had come home after years away. That should have been enough. At our age, you learn that family reunions are not guaranteed. Parents grow frail, siblings drift, old grudges harden, funerals begin to outnumber weddings. So when someone comes back alive and smiling in one piece and still able to sit at the family table, you are supposed to be grateful. I knew that. But sometime around 2 a.m, I turned toward Mark in the dark and whispered, "What exactly didn't line up?" He was awake before I finished the sentence. He always had been a light sleeper. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he rolled onto his side and looked at me. "You really want me to say it?" "No," I said honestly, "but say it anyway." The moonlight coming through the curtains outlined his face in pale blue. At 63, Mark had more silver in his hair than brown, and the lines around his eyes were deeper than when I'd first met him. But there was something steady in him that had only strengthened with time. He chose his words carefully. "Danny said he was stationed at Bagram during a certain period," he said. Then later he described an assignment that would have put him somewhere else entirely. Maybe he just misspoke. Maybe. He paused. He also mentioned serving with a unit designation that doesn't fit the ribbon set he was wearing. I stared at him. "I don't even know what that means." "I know," he said softly. "Most people wouldn't." The gentleness in his voice irritated me more than if he'd been sharp. "You're talking about my brother like he's a file on your desk." "I'm trying not to," Mark replied. I pushed the blanket down and sat up. "This is exactly why people think government men never retire. You all keep doing the job at the dinner table." Mark didn't react. He had heard my temper before and knew better than to step in front of it. After a moment he said, "Emily, I'm not trying to hurt you." "Then don't." "I'm trying to protect you." That made me turn and look at him. "From what?" He sat up too, resting his forearms on his knees. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe it's just a man exaggerating old stories because he wants his family to be proud. That happens. More than you'd think." His honesty took some of the heat out of me. "And if it's more than that, then better to learn it quietly," he said, "before life learns it loudly." That line stayed with me. The next morning I got up early and made coffee in my parents' kitchen while the house was still dim and cold. My mother liked the old drip machine, not the pod kind. Said coffee ought to smell like coffee, not plastic. I stood at the counter in my robe, listening to the gurgle of the pot and looking out at the backyard where frost still silvered the grass. Daniel came in wearing jeans and a thermal shirt, no medals, no uniform, just my brother again. "Morning, Emmy," he said. Nobody had called me Emmy except Daniel and my late grandmother. "Morning." He poured himself coffee black and leaned against the sink. For a moment we were just two kids again avoiding school by lingering in the kitchen. He smiled. Mom's still in heaven over last night. I noticed. She deserved a good night. There was something in the way he said it that sounded almost weary. I watched him stir nothing into his coffee. Did I what? Have a good night. He glanced at me, then away. Sure. He said it too quickly. I thought of Mark's words. Heroes don't get nervous about their own service history. And then I hated myself for even thinking it. Before I could say anything else, my mother came in wearing her pink housecoat and fuzzy slippers, cheerful as sunrise. There you both are, she said. Daniel Mrs. Grayson already called and asked if you'd come by the American Legion this week. Word travels fast in this town. Daniel laughed, but there was strain under it. I just got home, Mom. That's exactly why they want to see you. She kissed his cheek and reached for a mug. Your father's already telling everyone at church that his son is back. That smile faded from Daniel's face so quickly I almost missed it. Just for a second he looked trapped. By late morning, Mark and I drove back to our house 2 streets over. We had moved in after our youngest left for college, wanting something smaller than the farmhouse where we'd raised our children. It was a brick ranch with creaky floors, a narrow hallway, and a maple tree out front that dropped leaves into the gutters every fall whether we wanted it to or not. Once inside, I set my purse down and turned to him. Tell me everything. Mark hung his coat carefully before answering. I already told you what stood out. No, I said. You gave me the polite version. He nodded once. All right. We sat at the kitchen table. Morning light fell across the old oak surface, catching the scratches our children had made years ago doing homework and art projects. Mark folded his hands. When Jason asked about Afghanistan, he said Danny hesitated before answering. That by itself means nothing. But then he gave a broad description. Convoys, heat patrols, the kind of answer people give when they know the general shape of a story, but not the lived details. He could be private. Yes. He could be traumatized. Yes. He could just not want to talk about war over pot roast. Yes. Mark let each one land. Then he said, but when your father mentioned Fort Drum, Danny corrected him and used the wrong phrasing. A man who spent years in the service usually talks about a post a certain way. He didn't. I crossed my arms. You're saying the language was off. I'm saying the language was borrowed. A coldness settled in my chest. Mark went on carefully. The medals bothered me too. How? One of them suggested one kind of service timeline. Another suggested a different one. It's possible, but unusual. Then there was the way he touched them. What way? Like they were unfamiliar. I did not answer for a while. Finally, I said, you know what the worst part is? He waited. I can't tell whether I'm angry at you, I said, or angry that some part of me noticed it too. His face softened. That part of you is not betrayal, Emily, it's judgment. I shook my head. It feels like betrayal. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. Then let's do this gently. I looked down at our hands. What does gently look like? It looks like checking public records, he said. Nothing invasive, nothing improper, just enough to tell whether the story he's told your family matches the basic facts. I thought about my father lifting his glass the night before, my mother's wet eyes, the pride in the room. Then I thought about Daniel's face when she mentioned the American Legion. Not proud. Panicked. All right, I said quietly, we check. Mark nodded, but there was no satisfaction in him, only concern. That afternoon, while he opened his laptop in the den, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to move. It felt strange to examine my own brother this way. Shameful even. Yet a harder truth had begun to settle over me, one that comes to many of us later in life. Love does not cancel facts, and sometimes the people we have known the longest are the ones we see least clearly. When Mark looked up at me, he did not speak. He simply waited. I stepped into the room, closed the door behind me, and sat down beside him. Then I took a breath and said the words I never imagined I would say about my own brother. Start with his discharge date. The first thing I learned about investigating someone you love is that it feels nothing like the movies. There is no dramatic music, no dark alley, no clever one-liner at the end of a phone call. There is just a laptop on a desk in a quiet Pennsylvania house, 2 cups of coffee going cold, and the slow, sickening realization that every new fact might loosen a brick in the foundation of your family. Mark handled the computer, but I handled the silence. He was better at systems databases, the careful sorting of what mattered and what didn't. I was better at living with the discomfort that came after each small discovery. Between the two of us, it made for a long afternoon. We started with the basics. Publicly accessible military records, veteran registries, old local newspaper archives, alumni updates, property records, the kind of scattered trail a person leaves behind in American life without ever thinking about it. A mention here, a mailing address there, a reunion notice in a church bulletin, a county court filing 10 years back. At first, there was nothing that looked alarming. Daniel Carter, born in 1967, graduated from high school in our county in 1985, enlisted after 1 semester at the community college. That all tracked. In fact, for the first half hour I felt relief growing in me, a quiet embarrassment at having doubted him at all. I nearly said as much. Then Mark leaned closer to the screen and said, "There." "What?" He pointed to a date on one record and then opened another. "This service period ends earlier than it should." I frowned. What does should mean? It means if Danny served the full timeline he's described over the years, this date doesn't fit. I stared at the screen, but the terms blurred together. "So explain it in normal English." Mark sat back. "In normal English, he said your brother appears to have left active service several years earlier than he's told the family." I felt heat rise into my face. That could be a clerical error. It could. But you don't think it is. Number. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, a leaf blower whined somewhere down the block. Mrs. Healy from next door was dragging her trash bin to the curb in her house slippers. Life continued in all its ordinary forms, which somehow made what we were doing feel even more unreal. My brother had always told the same version of his life. He had served honorably for decades. He had seen things he rarely discussed. He had retired quietly. He did not boast exactly, but he accepted admiration in that solemn, modest way people trust. And now the dates did not line up. "Keep going," I said. Mark glanced at me. "You sure?" "No," I said, "but keep going." By mid-afternoon, we had pieced together more than I wanted to know and less than we needed. The official trail was patchy, but one thing became clearer. Daniel had not served as continuously as he implied. There were gaps, large ones. Years where his location and employment were murky. Years where he seemed to move from one rental address to another across Ohio and West Virginia. Years that never once came up in his polished stories at family gatherings. Mark wrote notes by hand on a legal pad, old-school neat block letters. 1985 enlistment. 1989 transfer. 1992 possible separation. 1993 to 1998 unclear. I hated that yellow pad. I hated the calm way he wrote on it. Most of all, I hated the small part of myself that had begun looking for patterns, too. At around 4 o'clock, I called my cousin Linda in Dayton. If every family has a historian, Linda was ours. She kept Christmas cards in labeled boxes, remembered anniversaries no one else did, and could tell you who attended whose graduation party in 1978 without pausing to think. She and Daniel had stayed in touch more than I had during certain years. When she answered, I forced brightness into my voice. "Linda, it's Emily." "Well, look who remembered she has a cousin," she said warmly. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. Her hip was still bothering her. Her grandson was thinking about transferring colleges. The Methodist Church had finally replaced the carpet in the fellowship hall. Normal things, anchoring things. Then I said, "Can I ask you something about Danny?" There was a pause. "What about him? Did he ever live near you for a while in the 90s? Another pause, longer this time. "Why are you asking?" I glanced toward the den where Mark sat quietly waiting. "Because I'm trying to piece together his timeline." Linda exhaled. "He was in Dayton for a bit," she said carefully. "Not long." "Doing what?" "I don't know exactly. Some kind of warehouse work, I think." I gripped the phone tighter. "Warehouse work. That's what he told us." "That doesn't make sense." Well, she said, her voice lowering a lot about that period didn't make sense. I closed my eyes. "Linda, what aren't you telling me?" She hesitated again, and when she spoke her tone had changed, softer, older. "Emily, I always assumed you knew more than I did." "Knew what?" "That Danny had a rough stretch." The room seemed to tilt. "What kind of rough stretch?" "Money troubles. Drinking for a while. He wasn't himself. Your Aunt Ruth let him stay with her for 3 months and then he disappeared again. We didn't ask too many questions." "Why not?" "Because your mother was so proud of him," Linda said. "And because at our age sometimes families make peace with the story they're given." That line cut deeper than she knew. After I hung up, I sat very still at the kitchen table. Mark came in a minute later. "Well?" I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded once, not in triumph, but in recognition. "This is starting to look less like a misunderstanding," he said. I looked at him sharply. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Sound professional." His expression softened. "I'm sorry." I rubbed my forehead. "Warehouse work," I said. "He told us he was deployed during that time." Mark sat across from me. "People lie for reasons, Emily." "Not like this." "Yes," he said gently, "exactly like this." I wanted to argue, but my energy was slipping. Around 6, our daughter Melissa called from Arizona. She was 60 now, retired from elementary school teaching, and somehow still had the voice of the girl who used to call home from college with laundry questions. "How's Grandpa's big celebration weekend?" she asked. I swallowed. "Fine." "You sound tired." "Just a long day." She laughed. "Well, that's what happens when your family gets old enough to turn every dinner into a reunion and a medical update." I smiled despite myself. Then she said, "Uncle Danny really okay?" He looked a little tense in those pictures Jason sent. I turned toward the hallway to make sure Mark couldn't hear, though of course he probably could. "Why do you say that?" "I don't know," she said. "Maybe I'm imagining it. He just had that look people get when they're trying hard." Trying hard. That was exactly it. Not proud, not peaceful. Trying hard. After the call, Mark found one more thread to pull. A Veterans Association newsletter from years back listed attendees at a regional event in Pittsburgh. Daniel's name appeared in a thank you section, not as an honored guest, but as support staff for event setup through a temp agency. It was a small detail easy to dismiss on its own, yet it fit uncomfortably with everything else. Men who retire with the rank and history Daniel implied generally are not invisible labor at veteran banquets. We both knew it. Neither of us said it aloud. By evening the sun had dropped and the den windows reflected our faces back at us, older, drawn, uncertain. Mark closed the laptop. "That's enough for today." "No," I said. "We still don't know what happened." "We know enough not to walk blind." He was right, but I hated it. I stood at the sink, washing out mugs that didn't need washing. My hands shook once, then steadied. "What if he's been lying for 30 years?" I asked. Mark took his time before answering. "Then the lie is carrying something heavy." I turned. "You almost sound sorry for him." "I am." That startled me. "For lying." "For whatever made him choose it," Mark said. I leaned against the counter and looked down at the wet ceramic in my hands. All my life Daniel had been the brave one, the one who left town, the one who came back with stories large enough to fill rooms, the one my father measured himself against in quiet, admiring ways. And now those stories were cracking. Not shattered yet, but cracking. Later that night before bed, I opened an old cardboard box in our hall closet where I kept family photographs. I found one of Daniel at 19 standing in our parents' yard on the day he left for basic training. He was skinny then, almost boyish, trying to look tougher than he was. My mother had written the date on the back in blue ink. He looked so young, so hopeful. I sat on the edge of the bed holding that photograph, wondering at what point a young man becomes a stranger inside his own life. Mark came in and saw the picture in my hand. He didn't ask for it, he just sat beside me. After a while I said, "Tomorrow I want to talk to someone who actually knew him in uniform." Mark nodded. "That's the right next step." I turned the photo over and traced the date with my thumb. If Daniel had lied, I still did not know why. But by then, one truth had already become impossible to ignore. Whatever my brother brought home to our family that weekend, it was not just honor. The next morning the house felt different. It wasn't anything you could point to exactly. The same sunlight came through the curtains, The same coffee pot hissed and sputtered on the counter. Outside, the same mail truck crept down Maple Street, stopping every few yards like it had for the past 30 years. But inside me, something had shifted. Once doubt enters your mind about someone you love, the world quietly rearranges itself around that doubt. Every memory becomes something you examine again. Every story gets replayed with new ears. Mark had already been awake for an hour when I came into the kitchen. He sat at the table with his reading glasses on the morning newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee mug. Retirement had not changed his habits much. He still woke early, still preferred printed news to screens, still believed a man should know what was happening in the world before breakfast. He looked up when I entered. "You sleep any?" "A little." That was not entirely true, but it was close enough. I poured coffee and sat across from him. "We need someone who served with Danny," I said. Mark nodded slowly. "I was thinking the same thing." He reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out the yellow legal pad from the day before. His notes were still there, calm and orderly, as if they belonged to someone else's family. "I did a little more searching early this morning," he said. That made me uneasy. "Already?" I couldn't sleep either. He slid the pad toward me. I found a name connected to Danny's early unit assignment. I looked down. Michael Torres, Staff Sergeant. The name meant nothing to me. Who is he? According to a few records, he served in the same logistics company as Danny during the late 80s. And he lives 2 counties over now. I stared at the name. "You want to call him?" "I want you to call him." "Why me?" "Because if I do it," Mark said gently, "it becomes an interrogation." That was probably true. By mid-morning, my hands were shaking slightly as I dialed the number we had found listed under Michael Torres in a veterans community directory. It rang 4 times. Then a gravelly voice answered. "Torres." "Mr. Torres," I said, "my name is Emily Carter." Silence. Then he said, "Carter, you related to Daniel Carter?" My stomach tightened. "Yes." Another pause. "Well," he said slowly, "that's a name I haven't heard in a long time." His tone carried something I couldn't quite identify. Recognition, but not warmth. "I hope I'm not bothering you," I said carefully. "My brother just returned home and our family's been celebrating. I was hoping to talk to someone who knew him during his service." Torres let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Celebrating, huh?" The way he said it made my chest tighten. "Yes," I said. "He served for many years." Another pause. Longer this time. Finally, Torres said quietly, "Ma'am, how much do you know about your brother's service?" I looked at Mark across the table. He watched me closely but said nothing. "I know what he's told us," I answered. Torres exhaled slowly. "Well, that might be the problem." My heart began to beat harder. "What do you mean?" There was the sound of a chair scraping across a floor on his end of the phone. "Your brother did serve," Torres said. "No doubt about that. Good kid when he first showed up, too. Smart, quick learner." Relief flickered briefly inside me. But I asked. But he didn't stay long. The word long echoed inside my head. "How long?" "Couple years." That didn't make sense. He told us he served decades. Torres didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice carried the quiet patience of a man who had repeated uncomfortable truths before. "Ma'am, Danny was discharged." The room seemed to shrink around me. "Discharged," I whispered. "Yes." "For what?" Torres hesitated. "I don't like speaking ill of a man behind his back." "I'm his sister," I said, "and my parents are elderly. If they've been told something untrue, I need to know." Another long pause. Finally, he said, "It wasn't criminal or anything like that." Relief washed over me for half a second. Then he continued. "It was a disciplinary discharge. Drinking on duty, a couple incidents that stacked up, nothing violent, just a young guy who couldn't keep himself together." My eyes filled with tears. "That can't be right." "I wish it wasn't." Mark leaned forward slightly but still said nothing. Torres continued, speaking, his voice almost apologetic. "Danny wasn't a bad man. In fact, a lot of us liked him. But the Army doesn't run on potential. It runs on discipline." "And the medals?" I asked weakly. "What medals?" I swallowed. "He came home wearing several decorations." Torres was silent for so long I thought the line had dropped. Then he said quietly, "Ma'am, Danny didn't earn any combat medals." The words felt like cold water. None. Number. My voice shook. He wore them last night. Torres sighed. Then someone sold him something he didn't deserve. I ended the call a few minutes later, though I barely remember how. The kitchen felt strangely distant, as if I were standing in someone else's house. Mark gently took the phone from my hand and placed it on the table. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, I whispered he lied. Mark nodded. Yes. I sank into the chair. Not just a little lie. Number. A lifetime lie. He didn't disagree. Tears slid down my cheeks, though I wasn't sure exactly what I was mourning. The brother I thought I knew. The pride my parents felt. Or the fragile version of Daniel that must have been hiding underneath it all. Why would he do this, I asked. Mark's voice remained soft. Shame. Shame. When people feel they've failed the people they love, he said they sometimes build a version of themselves that didn't fail. I thought about Daniel's face when Mom mentioned the American Legion. About how quickly his smile had faded. About how carefully he touched those medals. Like a man holding borrowed property. Later that afternoon, I drove back to my parents' house alone. Mark offered to come, but I shook my head. This part belongs to me. The house looked peaceful from the outside. Curtains open, wind chimes swaying softly on the porch. The same home where Daniel and I had grown up chasing each other down the hallway and arguing over who finished the milk. Inside, I could hear my father laughing. Daniel's voice followed. They were in the living room. I stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the truth in my chest like something fragile and dangerous. For the first time in my life, I realized something painful. My brother hadn't come home carrying glory. He had come home carrying a secret. And now, I was the one who knew it. I found Daniel in my parents' garage. The overhead door was half open, letting in a band of late-afternoon light that stretched across the concrete floor. Dust floated through it like tiny sparks. My father kept the garage the way he kept everything else in his life, orderly, practical, touched by years of use. Fishing rods in one corner, a snow shovel hanging on hooks, a workbench lined with coffee cans full of nails and screws that had probably been there since 1982. Daniel stood by the old freezer with a can of beer in his hand. He looked up when he saw me. Well, he said with a crooked smile, there you are. Mom said you came by. I closed the side door behind me. For a second, I just looked at him. No medals now, no dress uniform, no admiring audience. Just my brother in a flannel shirt and jeans, older around the eyes than I had let myself notice. He lifted the beer slightly. You want one? Number. He shrugged and took a sip. From inside the house, I could hear my mother's voice drifting faintly through the wall, followed by the sound of a cabinet closing. Ordinary household sounds, the kind that make confrontation feel almost obscene. Daniel studied my face. What's wrong? There are moments in life when you realize there is no graceful version of what comes next. I took a breath. I spoke to Michael Torres this morning. The change in Daniel's expression was immediate. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just the quiet draining away of color from a man who has suddenly understood that the room he is standing in no longer belongs to him. He lowered the beer can. You talked to who? Michael Torres, staff sergeant, your old unit. Daniel looked away toward the half-open garage door. The silence stretched. Finally, he gave a short, humorless laugh. Mark put you up to that. Don't do that. Do what? Don't make this about Mark. Daniel set the beer on the workbench with more care than necessary. So what exactly did Mike have to say? I stepped closer. You tell me. His jaw tightened. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he rubbed one hand over his mouth and gave a tired shake of the head. I should have known this was coming. The words hit me harder than any denial could have. Not what are you talking about, and he's lying. Just a worn-out admission that he had been waiting for the truth to arrive. My eyes stung. So it's true. Daniel leaned back against the workbench and stared at the floor. What part? The part where you didn't serve for decades. He said nothing. The part where you were discharged. Still nothing. The part where those medals weren't yours. At that, his eyes shut for a moment. When he opened them again, they looked older. Yes, he said. Just one word. Yes. I had prepared myself for anger, for excuses for that stubborn Carter pride that ran through every branch of our family tree. I had not prepared for surrender. I folded my arms tightly across my chest because I suddenly felt cold. How long, I asked. Daniel swallowed. I was in for just under 4 years. I stared at him. 4. He nodded once. You let Mom and Dad believe it was 25. I know. You let this whole town believe you were some decorated combat veteran. I know. You sat at that table last night while Daddy looked at you like... My voice broke. Daniel turned away. Emily. No. I stepped closer. You don't get to say my name like I'm the one who needs calming down. He nodded slightly. You're right. That almost made it worse. I wanted something from him I could push against. Defensiveness. Pride. A lie so obvious I could tear it apart and leave feeling righteous. Instead, I got a man who looked tired clear through his bones. Why, I asked. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You really want the whole thing? Yes. He picked up the beer again, then seemed to think better of it and set it back down unopened. When I enlisted, I meant it, he said. Every word I ever told you kids back then about serving, making something of myself, I meant all of it. I believed that. The photograph on my bed from the night before had shown me enough of the boy he'd been. But I said, but I was 20 years old and dumber than I knew. I got in with the wrong crowd off base, started drinking too much, missed responsibilities. One bad decision became another. He rubbed the back of his neck. It wasn't one big scandal. That would almost be easier to explain. It was a handful of stupid, weak choices that added up. And they discharged you. Yes. Why didn't you tell us? Daniel gave me a look I will never forget. Because in it I could see not the man in front of me but the younger one. He had been the one who had gotten off a bus years ago carrying a duffel bag and the ruins of his own expectations. Because Dad had told everybody his son was going to make a career of it, he said quietly. Because Mom cried when I left and told every woman in church to pray for me. Because this family didn't have much Emily, but we had pride. His voice cracked on the last word. And I came home with nothing. I felt my anger shift, not disappear, but move like furniture being dragged across a floor. What happened after? He gave a tired shrug. What happens to a lot of men who come home ashamed and don't know what to do with themselves? I bounced around. Warehouse jobs, construction, security work, slept on couches, drank too much for a few years, quit drinking after it nearly killed me. That matched what Linda had hinted at. And then he said I learned something. I waited. He looked straight at me. That people prefer a clean story. The words landed in the dusty air between us. A man who served, saw hard things, kept his mouth shut, and came home honorable, he said. People know where to put that man. They respect him. They make room for him at the table. He gave a small broken smile. A failed soldier with no plan and a bad few years in his rearview mirror. Nobody knows what to do with that man, not even his own family. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. But wasn't that exactly why he'd lied successfully for so long? Because we had all preferred the clean story. I looked at the shelves along the garage wall, the old paint cans, the cracked toolbox, the folded camping chairs my parents still kept, though they hadn't gone camping in 20 years. How did the lie get this big, I asked. Daniel let out a slow breath. It didn't happen all at once. At first I just let people assume things. Then I stopped correcting details. Then one lie covered another. Years passed. Mom and Dad got older. Dad's friends at the mill started dying off. People looked at me and saw something that made them happy. His eyes filled then, but he blinked the tears back. And after a while, I didn't know how to take it away from them. I stood there holding my own grief and fury, unsure which one deserved to speak first. Finally, I said the medals. Daniel looked down. I bought them online. The shame in his voice was almost unbearable. For what I asked. He answered without looking up. Because when I looked in the mirror, I wanted to see the man I should have been. That broke something in me. Not my anger. That stayed. But something underneath it softened painfully. I thought of my father in the dining room lifting his glass with those rough mill worker hands. My mother smoothing Daniel's sleeve as if she could iron all the years straight. And here in the garage stood the truth, not a hero, not a monster, just a man who had built a false life out of failure and longing, and then gotten trapped inside it. I swallowed hard. You understand this can't continue? Daniel nodded. I know. You have to tell them. At that he looked up sharply. All of it. Yes. Fear flashed through his face so openly that for a moment he looked like a boy again. It'll kill Dad. No, I said quietly, the lie will. He sat down heavily on the old stool by the workbench and pressed both hands over his eyes. For several seconds he didn't speak. Then, in a voice rough with exhaustion, he asked the question I had not expected. Do you hate me? I stood there in my father's garage with sunlight fading across the floor and felt the ache of a lifetime between us. No, I said, but I don't know who I've been loving. Daniel lowered his hands. That one landed. I could see it. And maybe that was the beginning of revenge, not humiliation, not exposure, but the moment a person is forced to stand bare before the damage they have done. I turned toward the door. Tomorrow, I said, you tell them, or I will. Then I left my brother alone in the garage with his beer, his silence, and the life he could no longer keep pretending was his. The next morning arrived the way difficult mornings always do, quietly, without any concern for the people who dread them. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen curtains at my parents' house, casting thin golden lines across the table, where we had celebrated just 2 nights earlier. The same tablecloth was still there, though my mother had folded it back neatly at the corners. The coffee pot was already on. Some habits do not wait for emotional storms. When I walked in, my father was seated in his usual chair reading the local newspaper. His glasses sat low on his nose, and he held the paper with both hands, like it was something steady in a world that had become increasingly uncertain over the years. Morning, kiddo, he said without looking up. Morning, Dad. My mother moved around the kitchen, humming softly the way she had done for decades. She set a plate of toast on the table. Danny should be down soon, she said. I told him we'd have breakfast together before church. Her voice carried that same warmth it always had. For a moment, I wished I could stop time right there. Just let the morning stay ordinary. But the truth has a way of moving forward even when the heart wants to stall. Daniel came in a few minutes later. He looked like he hadn't slept much. His eyes were red, and the easy smile he usually wore had disappeared. Still, he kissed Mom on the cheek and poured himself coffee like any other morning. My father glanced over the top of the newspaper. You look like you wrestled a bear last night, he said. Daniel forced a small laugh. Something like that. Then he looked at me. Just a quick glance. But enough. He knew. And I knew he knew. We sat down around the same table where the celebration had happened. 4 people now instead of a house full of relatives and neighbors. The quiet made every sound sharper, the scrape of a chair leg, the click of a spoon against a mug. My mother buttered her toast. So Danny, she said cheerfully, Mrs. Grayson said the American Legion would love for you to come speak next month. Tell the young folks about your service. Daniel didn't move. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. My father lowered the newspaper slowly. You hear your mother? Daniel set the cup down. Yes, sir. But he didn't look proud. He looked like a man standing on the edge of something steep. I felt my heart beating hard in my chest. This was his moment. The one I had given him. Daniel folded his hands on the table. Mom, Dad? My mother smiled. Yes, sweetheart. His voice was quiet. There's something I need to tell you. My father frowned slightly. What's that? Daniel looked down at the table. Then he looked back up. And for the first time since he'd come home, there was no performance in his face. No practiced story. Just truth. I didn't serve all those years. The room went completely still. My mother blinked. What do you mean? Daniel swallowed. I was in the army for a few years, but I didn't stay. My father sat very straight. Explain. Daniel nodded slowly. I made mistakes. I was young and I didn't handle the responsibility well. Drinking, mostly. Missed duties. Eventually, they discharged me. My mother's hand slowly lowered from the toast she had been holding. Discharged, she whispered. Yes. My father's voice became very quiet. And the medals? Daniel looked down. I bought them. That was the moment the silence changed. Not louder, but heavier. My father leaned back in his chair. For a long time he said nothing. I watched his face carefully. In 60 years of knowing my father, I had seen him angry, tired, proud, frustrated. But this expression was different. It was the look of a man rearranging his understanding of something he had believed deeply. Finally, he asked, "How long has this lie been going on?" Daniel answered honestly, 30 years. My mother covered her mouth. "Oh, Danny." Tears filled her eyes. "I told everyone." "I know," he said. "I prayed for you every Sunday." "I know." Her voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell us?" Daniel's shoulders sagged. "Because I thought you deserved a better son than the one who came home." The words hung in the room. My father stared at him for several seconds. Then he did something none of us expected. He sighed. Not an angry sigh. A tired one. "Son," he said slowly, "you think we wanted a hero." Daniel looked confused. "I thought you did." My father shook his head. "We wanted our boy." My mother reached across the table and touched Daniel's hand. "That's all we ever wanted." Daniel's eyes filled. "But I failed." My father shrugged. "So did I plenty of times." Daniel blinked. "You..." My father gave a small laugh. "Son, you think a man works 35 years in a paper mill and does everything right?" The tension in the room eased slightly. Not gone, but shifting. My father leaned forward. "What I'm disappointed about," he said, "is not the discharge." Daniel waited. "It's that you thought you had to lie to us for 30 years. Daniel's voice cracked. "I didn't want you to be ashamed of me." My father shook his head again. "Shame comes from lies, Danny, not from mistakes." My mother wiped her eyes with a napkin. "You must have been so lonely carrying that." Daniel looked at her stunned. "I thought you'd hate me." My mother stood and wrapped her arms around him. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "you're still my boy." Daniel broke then. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way men his age sometimes do when they finally stop holding something in. Across the table, my father looked at me. His eyes were calm. "You knew about this before today." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Yes." "Your husband too?" "Yes." He leaned back again. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "good thing one of you married a careful man." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. That small humor cracked the last of the tension in the room. Daniel wiped his eyes and took a shaky breath. "I'll tell the Legion the truth," he said. My father nodded. "That's the right start." My mother squeezed Daniel's shoulder. "And then you move forward." "How?" She smiled gently. "By living honestly." Later that afternoon, when I walked home with Mark, the autumn air felt different than it had the day before. Lighter. Truth does that. It hurts first. Then it clears the air. Mark listened quietly as I told him what had happened. When I finished, he nodded. "Sounds like your father handled it well." "He did." I paused. "Better than I expected." Mark smiled. "Sometimes the people we're trying hardest to protect are stronger than we think." I looked back toward my parents' house. Inside, my brother sat with them not as a hero, but as something more real. A man starting over. In the weeks after Daniel told the truth, our family moved through a strange kind of quiet. Not the quiet of anger. Not exactly the quiet of forgiveness either. It was the quiet that comes when something long hidden is finally brought into the light, and everyone has to learn how to live with the new shape of things. At our age, that kind of adjustment is familiar. Bodies change, marriages change, retirement changes the rhythm of a household, old friendships thin out, adult children move farther away than you ever imagined they would. So maybe that is why after the first shock wore off, my parents did not collapse under the truth the way Daniel had feared. They simply absorbed it. Not quickly, not painlessly, but steadily. My mother still cried on and off for a few days. I found her once at the kitchen sink drying the same plate long after it was already dry. She looked at me and said, "I'm not crying because he failed when he was young. I'm crying because he was alone with it for so long." That was my mother all over. She always found the wound underneath the offense. My father was quieter than usual. He spent more time in his recliner watching the evening news with the volume too low, his hands folded over his stomach. But when I brought him soup one afternoon, he said something I have thought about many times since. "A man can survive disappointment," he told me. "What wears him down is pretending." That was as close as my father came to philosophy, and it was enough. Daniel stayed in town. That more than anything told me the truth had changed him. The old Daniel, the one who had lived behind polished stories and borrowed honor, would have left after a confession like that. He would have found some reason to move along some wounded pride to hide behind. But this Daniel remained. He got up early and helped my father clear leaves from the gutters. He took my mother grocery shopping and carried in every bag without being asked. He fixed the loose railing on the back porch. He sat at the kitchen table in plain flannel shirts and drank coffee without trying to impress anybody. At first, the town did what towns do. People talked. News travels fast in places like ours. One woman tells another in the church parking lot. Somebody overhears something at the diner. A cousin repeats a half version at the barber shop. Before long, everybody knows enough to be wrong in 3 different directions. A few people were cruel about it. One man at the hardware store muttered "phony soldier" just loud enough to be heard. Daniel heard him, so did I. Daniel kept walking. That was the moment I knew he was finally telling the truth with his life, and not just with his mouth. A week later, he asked if I would go with him to the American Legion Hall. Not to give a speech, to volunteer. I looked at him across my kitchen table where he had come to ask in person, turning his coffee mug slowly in both hands, like a man still learning what honesty required. To do what I asked. Whatever they need, he said. Set up chairs, sweep floors, drive folks to appointments if they need rides. I studied him for a moment. Why? He gave a small shrug. Because I can't undo what I did, he said. But I can stop taking up space that belongs to better men and start being useful instead. That answer stayed with me. So I went. The Legion Hall smelled like old coffee floor wax and decades of fish fries. The men there were a mixture of generations: Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Some were broad and hardy, some were frail. A few carried themselves with that unmistakable stiffness of men whose bodies had paid interest on old service injuries for years. Daniel did not walk in like a hero. He walked in like a worker. And when the post commander, a Vietnam veteran named Earl Bennett, came over to speak with him, Daniel told the truth plainly. I wasn't what I claimed to be, he said, but I'd still like to help if you'll let me. Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you stack tables?" Daniel nodded. Earl pointed toward the back room. Then start there. No grand speech. No ceremony. Just work. Sometimes that is the most American kind of grace there is. Over the next 2 months, Daniel became dependable in a way I had never seen before. He drove Mr. Kowalski to his physical therapy appointments at the VA clinic in Pittsburgh. He helped Mrs. Bennett sort donated winter coats for a veterans outreach drive. He spent Saturday mornings repairing loose hinges, carrying boxes, and cleaning out storage closets nobody else wanted to touch. He did not talk much about redemption. He practiced it. One evening close to Thanksgiving, our family gathered again at my parents' house. Not for a celebration this time, just dinner. Turkey breast green beans stuffing from a box, because my mother claimed she was too old to impress anyone with homemade anymore, though she still made her pumpkin pie from scratch, because some habits are sacred. Daniel came in wearing jeans and a navy sweater. No medals. No costume. Just himself. My son Jason hugged him at the door. My daughter Melissa called in on speakerphone from Arizona. My father said grace, his voice a little shaky but sure. When we sat down, the room felt warmer than it had during that first grand homecoming dinner. Not more impressive. More honest. At one point, my father lifted his water glass. We all looked at him. He cleared his throat. To second chances, he said. Then he looked directly at Daniel. And to the truth, even when it arrives late. We all raised our glasses. Daniel's eyes filled, but he smiled. This time it came naturally. Later that night, after dishes were done and leftovers packed away, I stood alone for a moment on my parents' back porch. The air was cold enough to sting, and somewhere down the street a dog barked once before settling down again. Mark stepped out beside me and slipped his hand into mine. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. And for once it was completely true. I looked through the kitchen window at my family, my mother drying plates, my father settling into his chair, my brother laughing softly at something Jason had said. A different man than the one who had walked in wearing borrowed honor. A better one, I thought. Not because he had become impressive. Because he had become real. That was the moral left behind for me, the one with a little ache still attached to it. People can survive the truth more often than they can survive a lie. Pride may build a polished life, but honesty builds a livable one. And real family is not the people who clap the loudest for your image. It is the people who stay when the image falls away. So if this story stirred something in you, if you have ever carried an old hurt, an old secret, or an old disappointment, maybe take a quiet moment and ask yourself what truth in your life still deserves daylight. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need that reminder too. Thank you for spending this time with me.